Investor Mark Mobius calls an AI bubble, but should you listen? Legendary emerging markets investor Mark Mobius, age 89, says top AI names could fall 30 to 40% before resuming a long-term uptrend. He points to stretched valuations and a capex binge, and he favors emerging markets right now, especially China and India. Here's the context, though. Most investors miss. Authority bias is powerful. A big resume is not a risk model. We remember the famous name and forget the decade-long scoreboard. If you had put $100,000 into a broad emerging markets fund for the last 10 years, something like a Mark Mobius fund, you'd be sitting at roughly $192,000 today. Hey, that sounds like a lot of money, a big win, right? But if you had simply bought an S&P 500 index fund, you'd be around $412,000 today. That's an opportunity cost of about $220,000 for believing the emerging market comeback story, while the S&P quietly compounded. Now, this doesn't mean Mobius can't nail a pullback. Market's correct. It means don't outsource your brains to anyone's legend. If you plan to buy the dip, pre-commit your rules now. What will you buy? How much will you add per 10% drawdown? What evidence, cash flow growth, margin durability, capex payback will tell you AI spending is translating into durable earnings? Respect the experience, yes, but invest by rules, not by aura. What's the real message? When a famous investment guru like Mark Mobius makes a prediction, everything's going to crash or go down by 40 or 50%, be skeptical. They're sometimes right, but most of the time they're wrong. They're getting that attention because of past successes and just because it's a dramatic prediction. Let's dig a little deeper here. So this is a business show, but it's not an investment advice show. So let me be very clear. I'm not telling you ignore investment guru Mark Mobius. He might be right. What I want to do here is dig a little deeper to give you a sense of why you're even hearing his prediction. First of all, he's famous. He's been around for decade after decade after decade. He's had a lot of good years. He's made a lot of money for himself and for his investors. I remember it has to be 30 years ago, 40 years ago. There were all these TV commercials of this really cool looking bald guy living out of a plane, his private jet flying around to emerging markets. And the company he was working for at the time, I believe it was Templeton, really branded him. And he became a legend. He made a lot of money. He's fabulously wealthy. But that doesn't mean he's right today. Now, he's only a few months away from being 90. Doesn't mean he can't still be a good investor. Look at Warren Buffett. But it does mean you shouldn't necessarily place faith in him just because he's had successes before. Now, I mentioned in the newsread, if you look at the last 10 years, if you had believed in Mark Mobius, put your money with him, if you invested $100,000 with him versus the S&P 500, you would have lost $220,000 compared to what you would have gotten, not by having a fancy investment guru, a fancy financial manager managing your money, but if you had just gone into a plain old vanilla, boring S&P 500, a Vanguard index fund for the S&P 500. The sort of thing that if you mention it at a cocktail party, everyone falls asleep. You don't get invited back because they think you're so boring. It's always exciting to talk about, oh, I've got this great guru who's mystical and flies around the world, and he told me to buy this stock, and look how well I'm doing. You'll get a lot more attention that way. The other reason I call this to your attention is because it's essential when you are reading financial media, when you are watching financial podcasts and TV shows and CNBCs, there is always a bias in favor of the big dramatic call. So when someone with a famous name like Mark Mobius says, technology stocks are set to fall by 40%, it's dramatic, it's interesting, it's bold, it's provocative, it's therefore interesting copy. It makes for a nice headline on a website or a paper newspaper or a Barron's magazine if you still read something in that format. But it doesn't make it any more likely to happen. And I want you to realize that we are all affected by biases. There's a lot of conversation these days about so-called media bias. The biggest media bias isn't necessarily a left-right bias or a partisan bias. It's a bias in favor of the most interesting story, the most dramatic story. So when a Mark Mobius says the market's going to crash by 40%, or when Robert Kiyosaki says, abandon the stock market, put everything in real estate. Remember, that's the media displaying its bias in favor of the biggest, boldest, most dramatic thing. Again, I'm not here to give you stock advice, but I can tell you if you constantly buy and sell based on what famous people tell you is the most dramatic thing and the sort of thing that gets them attention, you are likely to buy and sell your way to massive financial losses. That I can pretty much guarantee you. The other thing is, certainly Mark Mobius is not the only investor these days or market analyst to say, well, hey, we're in an AI bubble. It's going to crash. It's overinflated. Look at something like Tesla, which is absurdly overinflated, and its stock price bears no relation even to other AI companies. So there's more and more conversation about, is there an AI bubble? Are we settled for a crash? Let's not forget history. We heard this again and again and again in 1997 by many who said, there's an internet bubble. There's an internet bubble. There's an internet bubble. So if you sold everything in 97, you lost a lot of money. If you sold everything in 1998, you lost a lot of money. You sold everything in 1999 and you got out of the market, you lost a lot of money because they were 3 years too early. Market crash 2000. So that's the real problem with listening to so-called experts, especially famous experts, especially ones who got it right the last downturn, is they're always looking for something to validate their mindset that they are right and everyone else in the market is wrong. And therefore, if something is up, it's ready for crash. Things do go up and down, but not necessarily the same time period that these so-called experts are predicting. So what's the real takeaway? I'm a huge believer in what John Bogle says. He's the founder of Vanguard, and his whole rationale of investing, the whole concept behind these index funds is you and I are too stupid to time the market. Now, I'm sorry if that sounds condescending. It's actually the opposite of condescending. It's the ultimate in humility, because John Bogle didn't think he was smart enough to pick winners and losers. The whole point of an index fund is you're essentially putting your ego aside and saying, I'm not smart enough to know which stock is going to go up, which stock is going to go down. Therefore, I'm going to really diversify and spread risk out over typically hundreds of companies. Or if it's the S&P 500, you're spreading your risk out across 500 companies. And at that point, some stocks go up, some stocks go down. What you're betting on is the entire market going up. People who've made that bet over the last 10 years have won. Have there been down years? Yes. But over the long haul, the last 10 years, the last 20 years, the last 70 years, people who bet on the market in general have done much, much better than most people who choose particular stocks or even particular industry. And that's the number one guiding principle I have in my own investment life. I would like you to not necessarily follow my investment strategy because I'm not giving you an investment strategy. I would like you to check your own bias. Every person I know, for the most part, thinks that they're smart enough to outsmart the market. And any one day, any one stock pick, they could. It's always about the long term. Where do you stand? Because here's the one thing we know with absolute certainty. 95% of so-called professional managers, money managers, people who have MBAs from Harvard and Stanford and Columbia, people who have Bloomberg terminals on their desk, people who go to lunch with informed journalists and CEOs, people who have inside information, 95% of them over a 20-25 year period do not beat the index, whatever index they compare themselves. Certainly the S&P 500 index, they don't beat the index once you factor in their fees. So anytime you think you can make a prediction about a particular stock or even a particular sector going up or down a lot, and that you're going to be smarter than most people, what you're really saying is you're going to be better than 95 out of 100 people who do this professionally for a living. Now, let me ask you, if you played poker for a few times and you go to the World Series of Poker, and all of a sudden you're playing poker with people who are full-time professional poker players. They play in tournaments around the world every week, all year long. You might be confident that you could win a game here or there. You might be confident you could even win a round. But are you confident you would beat 95 out of 100 of these professional poker players every time? That's essentially what you're doing every single time you pick a particular stock, buying or selling a stock, or for that matter, listening to an expert, no matter how successful they've been in the past, on which way the market.